Get her off my bird. The enemy commander's voice crackled through the stolen radio frequency, cold and deliberate. She's the one keeping them alive. Take her out first. Staff Sergeant Rachel Donovan heard every word of it, and she didn't flinch. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because Private First Class Danny Kowalski was bleeding out on the ground 6 feet away from her, and fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. They had targeted her specifically. In the middle of a war zone, with rockets tearing up the earth around her, someone had just put a price on her head, not for what she'd done wrong, but for what she refused to stop doing right. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Rachel's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you were watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way most bad days do, quietly. Rachel Donovan had been awake since 4, which wasn't unusual. Sleep at Forward Operating Base Kilo was less of a rest and more of a negotiation. You closed your eyes and you bargained with the darkness. Give me 2 hours, just 2, and I'll function tomorrow. Most nights, the darkness didn't hold up its end of the deal. Rachel had learned to stop complaining about it. She was sitting on an overturned ammo crate outside the aid station, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a boot, when Corporal Tasha Williams dropped down beside her without asking permission. You sleep, Tasha asked. Some. That mean no. That means some. Tasha pulled out a pack of gum, offered a piece, and Rachel took it without looking up. They'd been doing this long enough that conversation wasn't always necessary. 3 deployments together, 2 in the same hellhole, 1 in a different one. Tasha knew Rachel's silences the way a sister knows a sister, not because she'd been told, but because she'd stayed. Medevac rotation today, Rachel said finally. I know. Kowalski's on my team. Tasha was quiet for a second. He's green. He's 22. That's what I said. Rachel finished her coffee, set the cup down on the dirt, and looked out past the perimeter wire. The sky in the east was doing that thing it did sometimes, going orange and purple at the same time, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. She thought, not for the first time, that if you stripped away everything else, the noise, the fear, the smell of diesel and blood, this place had a sky that could stop your heart. He'll be fine, Rachel said. She wasn't sure if she was talking about Kowalski or herself. Tasha didn't answer, which meant she wasn't sure either. The briefing was at 0600 in a concrete room that smelled like mildew and old sweat. Captain Gerald Marsh stood at the front with his pointer and his flat affect and his way of describing catastrophic scenarios in the same tone most men use to order lunch. Intelligence has the Eastern Valley compromised, he said. 2 clicks from the secondary road. Enemy has repositioned overnight. They've got elevated positions on the ridge, which means the landing zone we used last week is no longer viable. He tapped him on the map. New LZ is here, narrower, shorter approach window. You'll be exposed on the north side for approximately 40 seconds during descent. 40 seconds. Rachel wrote that down. 40 seconds was a long time when people were shooting at you. The wounded, she asked. Marsh looked at her. He always looked at her like she was asking a question she already knew the answer to. 4 critical, 2 walking. Field medics on site have done what they can, but 2 of the 4 need surgical intervention inside the next. He checked his watch. 3 hours. Rachel felt her jaw tighten. 3 hours. That meant they were already behind. What's the bird situation? Dust-off 7 is prepped and ready. Crew of 4 pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, gunner. Your team goes in with them. He looked around the room. Any questions? Nobody asked anything. That was its own kind of answer. Private First Class Danny Kowalski found her 20 minutes later while she was loading her med bag. He was tall in the way that made Rachel think he'd probably been the tallest kid in his class for most of his life, the kind of height that made people assume a confidence he clearly hadn't grown into yet. He had a spot on his chin he'd nicked shaving and a look on his face that he was trying very hard to keep neutral. He was failing. Sergeant Donovan, Kowalski, can I ask you something? She kept loading. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, nasopharyngeal airways IV kits. She counted by feel. 14 years of doing this, and her hands moved on their own. You're going to ask me regardless of whether I say yes, so go ahead. He hesitated. How do you, when it's happening, when it's actually happening out there, how do you know what to do first? Rachel stopped what she was doing. She turned and looked at him, really looked not at the uniform or the rank or the baby face at the question underneath the question. He wasn't asking about triage protocols. He was asking how you hold yourself together when everything around you is falling apart. She'd been asked that before. She'd asked it herself once. You don't know, she said. Not until you're in it. The training is there. It's in your body. It'll move your hands even when your brain is screaming. But knowing is different from doing. You'll figure that out today. That's not exactly reassuring. It wasn't supposed to be. It's supposed to be honest. She zipped the bag. Stay close to me, do what I say, and don't stop moving. Movement is the only thing that keeps panic from winning. He nodded slowly. Yes, Sergeant. And Kowalski. Yeah. Eat something before we go. You don't operate well on an empty stomach, and I'm not babysitting a guy who faints on me. He almost smiled. Almost. Roger that. Dustoff 7 was already spinning up when they reached the flight line. The bird was a UH-60 Blackhawk, and it had the look of a machine that had been through enough to have opinions about it. The crew chief, a compact woman named Specialist Reyes, who Rachel had flown with before, was doing her walk-around with the focused calm of someone who had decided a long time ago that worrying was inefficient. Donovan Reyes said without looking up, "You're center left. Your people go where I point." Same as always. Good. Marsh tell you about the approach. 40-second exposure. 38, actually. I told him 40 so he'd feel better about it. Reyes patted the fuselage. She's been running a little hot on the port engine. Pilot's aware. Should be fine. It should be. Rachel had spent her career learning to hear everything that existed in the space between should and will. She stowed her bag, got her team situated Kowalski Corporal James Adeyemi and Specialist Louisa Park, and strapped in. The rotors hit full speed. The world outside went from comprehensible to just sound and wind and vibration. Adeyemi leaned over and said something she couldn't hear. She read his lips. We good, She gave him a thumbs up that she mostly believed. They were 12 minutes out when the radio crackled. The pilot, Lieutenant Samir Khalid, came over the intercom with a voice that was professionally calm in a way that made Rachel's stomach drop. Dustoff 7 to base, we are receiving. Say again, Dustoff 7, we have reports of enemy movement on the ridge above the new LZ. We're advised to hold. Rachel pressed the intercom button. Khalid, what's the status of the 4 critical? A pause, static. Then from the ground frequency, a voice she didn't recognize, a field medic, young, strained to the edge of breaking. 2 of the 4 won't make it past another hour. One of them's got a tension pneumo I've been managing manually. My hands are cramping. I need you here. She looked at Khalid through the gap between the cockpit and the cabin. He turned his head slightly. He wasn't going to make this call alone. Rachel keyed the intercom. We go in. Enemy on the ridge. Then we go in fast. What's our window if we push the approach? Reyes' voice. 20 seconds of exposure instead of 38 if we come in from the southwest. Tighter angle. Harder landing. Do it. Khalid was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, adjusting approach. Brace for hard descent. Kowalski grabbed the cargo strap next to him with both hands. His knuckles were white. Rachel looked at him and did something she rarely did in a bird. She reached over and put her fist against his arm once, firmly. Not comfort exactly. Acknowledgement. I see you. You're still here. That's enough. He loosened his grip. Not much, but some. The descent was controlled violence. Khalid dropped them at an angle that pressed everyone into their seats like something was sitting on their chests, and then leveled out 10 feet above the ground in a move that should have been impossible, and wasn't only because he'd clearly done it before. The skids hit dirt, and Rachel was moving before they fully settled, her bag in hand, Adeyemi right behind her, Kowalski, a half second after that. The field medic who'd been on the radio was a kid named Ortega, and he was crouched over a man whose chest was rising and falling in a way that was wrong, too fast, too shallow, desperate. Ortega had 2 fingers pressed into a chest wound, and his face was the color of old paper. Tension pneumo, Rachel confirmed it in a second. He needs a needle decompression right now. I know I've been vacant. Move. Not unkindly, just absolutely. Ortega moved. Rachel was already pulling the 14-gauge needle from her bag, finding the landmark by touch. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and driving it in. The hiss of released air was the best sound she'd heard all morning. The man's breathing changed immediately, became something closer to real. "That's Sergeant Harris," Ortega said from behind her. "He's been unconscious for 20." The first RPG hit 40 meters away. The shock wave was physical. It pushed Rachel sideways and she went with it, kept her hands on Harris and came back up without thinking. Adeyemi was already shouting coordinates into the radio. Park was loading the second litter, working fast and clean. Kowalski had frozen for exactly 3 seconds. Rachel counted and then he'd unfrozen himself and was doing what she'd told him to do, which was move. "Kowalski, I need a line in Harris' left arm, 16 gauge wide open." "On it." Another explosion. Closer. Rachel didn't look up. You couldn't look up. Looking up was how you died. You stayed in your lane, you stayed with your patient, you let the people with guns handle the people with guns, and you handled the people who were bleeding. That was the job. That was always the job. Lines in. Kowalski's voice was too high. She could hear the adrenaline in it, bright and sharp and on the edge. "Good. Bag 'em up. Let's move." Harris goes first. They got 3 of the 4 critical on the bird in under 4 minutes, which Rachel knew was fast and also knew wasn't fast enough. The 4th, a woman specialist, Rima Yun, both legs shrapnel damaged, femoral bleed, slowed but not stopped, was 20 meters away, and the 20 meters between her and the helicopter had become a problem. Enemy fire had repositioned. It was coming from the north now, which meant the path between Yun's position and the bird was in the direct line. Adeyemi looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at Reyes, who was at the helicopter door and had heard everything over the tactical net. "Suppressing fire from the bird's M240 can cover the north approach," Reyes said. "Maybe. Gunner's got about 30 seconds of sustained before he has to reload." 30 seconds is enough." "Maybe. I heard you the first time." Rachel looked back at Yun, who was conscious and watching her with eyes that were working hard to stay focused. 22 years old. Same age as Kowalski. Rachel did a calculation that wasn't really a calculation at all. It was a decision that had already been made before she consciously made it. "Kowalski, you're with me. Adeyemi, you stay with Harris. Keep that line open. Do not let his pressure drop. Park." "I've got the others," Park said immediately. "Reyes, tell your gunner to give me 30 on my mark." Reyes keyed her radio, confirmed. Rachel looked at Kowalski. He was breathing too fast, but his eyes were steady. "You ready?" "No," he said, honestly. "That's fine. Go anyway." She ran. The 30 seconds felt like a year and also like nothing. The M240 opened up from the bird's door in a sustained roar that Rachel felt in her teeth, and she and Kowalski crossed the open ground to Yun's position in what was probably 15 seconds, but felt like 15 years. Yun was lighter than she looked. That happens sometimes with blood loss, the body becoming less of itself. Rachel got her arm under Yun's shoulders. Kowalski took her legs without being told, and they ran back the way they'd come. The M240 went silent. Reload. The north position opened up immediately. Something hit the ground 6 inches from Rachel's left foot, and she felt a spray of dirt on her boot and thought in a very clear and calm part of her mind that was close and kept running. Kowalski made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like a noise a person makes when their body processes the reality of almost dying a half second before their brain does, and then he kept running too. They hit the helicopter door at the same time. Reyes grabbed Yun from the other side and Rachel pushed while Kowalski lifted, and then all 3 of them were inside and Rachel was yelling, "Go, go, go!" before she'd even fully processed that she was back on the bird. Khalid didn't need to be told twice. They were airborne before Rachel had Yun's tourniquet repositioned, and she was working one-handed on the femoral pressure dressing while the helicopter banked hard to the south and the earth fell away below them. She could hear Harris breathing behind her, still wrong, but less wrong. Park was monitoring the other 2. Ortega had come aboard with them, whether by accident or design Rachel hadn't established, and he was doing something useful with IV fluids. Kowalski was sitting against the forward bulkhead with his hands on his knees. He was shaking. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor, the kind the body produces when it realizes all the adrenaline it spent wasn't going to be needed anymore and doesn't quite know how to stand down. He looked up and found Rachel's eyes. She held them for a second. Then she pointed at Yun and pointed at him. "Help me." And he nodded and pushed off the bulkhead and came forward. That was when the radio crackled. It wasn't their frequency. It was close, a bleed, over the kind that happened sometimes when enemy forces had captured or cloned equipment. The voice on the other end was speaking in accented English, deliberate and unhurried, and it said, "Get her off my bird. She's the one keeping them alive. Take her out first." The cabin went still. Not completely still, the rotors were still screaming, the wind was still tearing at everything. Yoon was still bleeding, but there was a quality of stillness inside all that noise, the kind that happens when everyone in a space hears something at the same time and all their minds arrive at the same place simultaneously. They were talking about Rachel. Khalid's voice came over the intercom, tight, controlled. "Donovan, did you copy that?" She pressed the intercom. "What's our time to extraction?" 18 minutes. 18 minutes. She looked at Yoon, at Harris, at Kowalski, who was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not fear exactly, but the specific kind of reckoning that comes when you understand that the situation is more serious than you were previously aware. "Sergeant Donovan," he said quietly. "Keep pressure on that dressing," she told him. "They're targeting you specifically." "I know. Keep pressure on the dressing." "What are we, Kowalski?" She said it the way you say a name when you want someone to stop talking and start listening. He stopped. He listened. "We have 4 critical in 18 minutes and they haven't hit us yet. So we work. When they hit us, if they hit us, we'll deal with it then. Right now we work." "Understood." A long pause. The helicopter shuddered through turbulence. Outside, somewhere behind them, something was probably following. "Understood," he said. She turned back to Yoon. 12 minutes later, everything changed. The sound was different. That was the first thing, not the crack of small arms, not the percussion of an RPG. It was a higher pitch, a shriek of something moving through air faster than it had any right to. And Khalid's voice came over the intercom with the first trace of urgency Rachel had heard from him all day. Incoming. The impact wasn't where they were. It was close. Close enough that the shockwave hit the bird like an open palm, sending it sideways, sending everyone without a handhold in some direction that wasn't planned. Rachel caught the cargo webbing with her left hand. Yoon slid 2 inches, and Rachel's right hand still on the pressure. Dressing moved with her. Park caught one of the litter rails. Adeyemi swore in Yoruba, which Rachel knew was a sign of genuine extremity, because he'd once told her he only reverted to his first language when English wasn't sufficient. Kowalski hit the forward bulkhead with his shoulder and stayed there. "Port engine," Reyes called from the door. "We took shrapnel." "Khalid, I've got it. I've got it." His voice had changed, not panicked, but present in a way that it hadn't been before closer to the surface. "We're losing fuel on the port side. I can keep her in the air, but I'm going to need to push the speed, which means the approach is going to be rough." "How rough?" Rachel asked. A pause. "Crash landing rough." The cabin was absolutely silent for exactly 1 breath. Then Rachel said, "What do you need from us?" "Keep the weight centered. Get everyone as far from the port side as you can. And Donovan, yeah, whatever you're doing back there, keep doing it, because we need everybody on this bird in working condition when we hit the ground." She looked around at Harris and his desperate lungs, and Yoon and her bleeding leg, and Kowalski and his shaking hands, and Park, who was already repositioning herself without being told, and Ortega, who was pale but functional, and Adeyemi, who had stopped swearing and was simply working. 18 minutes had become 11. 11 minutes to keep everyone alive. She grabbed her bag. She went back to work. The fuel warning had been going off for 6 minutes when Khalid spotted the extraction point. Rachel knew because Reyes told her, and she also knew because she could feel the change in the helicopter's attitude, the subtle shift of a machine that is being pushed past its comfort and knows it. Harris had gone into VTCAX 4 minutes ago. She'd gotten him back with a precordial thump that she'd had to perform one-handed while holding the cargo strap with the other because the bird was pitching. It had worked. She wasn't sure if it would hold. Yoon was conscious. That was something. She'd been talking for the last 3 minutes, not coherently. Half sentences about her mother's kitchen, about a dog she'd had growing up, about something that had happened in high school that made her laugh even now. Rachel let her talk. It meant she was oxygenating. It meant she was still here. Kowalski was behind her doing what she needed him to do without being asked anymore. She'd noticed that. The transition had happened somewhere over the mountains, and she hadn't seen exactly when, just looked up at some point and realized that the kid who'd been shaking against the bulkhead had been replaced by someone who was working. "Park," Rachel called. "Harris's pressure, 60 over palp, dropping. Push the fluids. Already on it." "Ortega, how's Martinez?" She'd finally gotten the name straight, the four critical. Were Harris, Yun Martinez, and a man named Cole, whose injuries she'd handed off to Park because she'd had to make a triage decision, and Park was good enough. "Martinez is stable," Ortega said. "Relatively." "Cole firing, Park holding. 4 patients, 4 different unplanned catastrophes. 18 minutes of flight time turned into 11, turned into Rhea's voice. 2 minutes to the LZ. Khalid says brace. He means it." Rachel straightened up. She looked at her team. Every single one of them looked back at her. And in that look, there was something she recognized, and that she would never be able to adequately explain to anyone who hadn't been in a medevac at the edge of its capabilities with wounded people in the back and enemy contact behind them. It was not hope exactly, and not quite trust, but something that combined both things into something harder and more real than either of them separately. She said, "We land, we move fast. Every one of these people comes off this bird. Nobody stays." "Understood." 4 voices, ragged, immediate. "Understood." The helicopter screamed down toward the earth, and then everything happened at once. The port engine seized with a sound like God slamming a door, and the bird lurched hard left, and Khalid pulled back on the stick with both hands, and everything Rachel had ever learned about staying calm in a crisis was tested in the next 4 seconds, in ways that she would not remember clearly. She knew she grabbed Harris's litter with both hands. She knew she felt something tear in her left side that was going to matter. Later, she knew she heard Kowalski shout something behind her. And she knew that this ground came up and hit the helicopter in a way that was violent and terminal and also survivable. The skids hit. They held. The bird rocked, listed, settled, and went quiet. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The rotors wound down. Something dripped. Wind moved through the open door. Then Rhea's, we're down, everybody count off." One by one, bruised and shaking and breathing, they counted off. Rachel's count came last, and when she said it, her voice had something in it she wasn't proud of. Something that broke slightly at the edges. Kowalski turned and looked at her, and she knew from his expression that he could see the thing she was holding her hand against. The left side. The thing that had torn. "Sergeant Donovan, get Harris off the bird," she said. "Now, move. You're injured." "I'm aware. Get Harris off the bird." He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he nodded and turned and moved. "That was the job. That was always the job. You did not stop. You did not wait for someone to tell you it was okay. You did not count your own damage until everyone else's was dealt with." She pressed harder against her side, and she followed him. The helicopter had stopped moving, but Rachel's hands hadn't. That was the thing about training that nobody told you until you were already inside it. Your body didn't wait for your mind to process what had just happened. It kept going. It moved through the shock the way water moves through a cracked wall, finding the path forward before the structure had even finished deciding it was broken. Rachel's hands were already on Harris's litter straps before the rotors had fully wound down, already working the release clips, already calculating the weight and the angle, and the number of steps between the bird and the flat ground, 10 feet away where the extraction team was supposed to be waiting. Supposed to be. She looked out the door. 4 men in American uniforms were running toward them from the tree line. She didn't recognize any of them, which wasn't unusual. Extraction teams rotated, but something moved in the back of her mind, quiet and cold, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 2.5 deployments, and she held it without acting on it, the way you hold a word in your mouth before you decide whether to say it. "Reyes," she said. "Yeah." "You recognize the extraction team." A pause. Reyes leaned out the door and looked, and in the 2 seconds it took her to look, Rachel watched the expression on her face do something complicated. "No," she said, "but that doesn't mean, call it in, right now, verify." Reyes was already on the radio. The 4 men were 30 meters out. "Kowalski," Rachel said not loudly, "get Harris off the left side away from those men. Move slow, don't make it obvious." Kowalski looked at her. He understood immediately. She could see it register, could see him clock the situation in the same breath she'd described it. He didn't ask questions. He got his hands under Harris's litter and started moving. 20 meters. Reyes said into the radio, Dustoff 7 to Overwatch requesting verification of extraction team at Lima Zulu November. 4 personnel approaching from the east. Over. Static, then Dustoff 7, we do not say again. We do not have a 4-man extraction element at your position. Our team is still 4 minutes out. Do not repeat, do not allow approach. 15 meters. Rachel's voice came out flat and absolute. Adeyemi. Already on it. He'd heard everything. He was already at the door with his rifle, and Ortega was behind him, and Park had moved herself and Cole to the back of the bird without a word. The 4 men slowed. They could feel something had changed the way a predator feels a shift in its prey. The one in front raised a hand, a gesture of peace, and called out in English. "We're here for the wounded. We're here to help." Rachel stepped to the door. She kept her hand pressed against her left side. She said loudly, clearly, with every ounce of authority she had, "Stop where you are. Identify your unit and your commanding officer." The man in front smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach anything. And then he reached into his jacket. Minute 2. What happened in the next 4 seconds would take Rachel months to fully reconstruct. And even then the sequence would shift and reorder itself depending on the day and her mood and how much sleep she'd gotten the night before. Adeyemi fired first. He was faster than anyone she'd ever worked with, and she had thanked God for that fact on more than one occasion, and she thanked God for it again now. In the half second between the man's hand going into his jacket and the rifle coming up, that would have ended several things that were not yet finished. The man went down, the 3 behind him scattered. Someone was shooting from the tree line, not at them, at the 3 men who'd scattered, which meant the actual extraction team had arrived early, or someone else was out there with aligned interests, and Rachel didn't have time to determine which. "Go, go, go," she heard herself saying. Her voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone further away, someone who wasn't pressing a hand against the left side that was making increasingly persuasive arguments for her attention. "Get the patients off the bird, get them low move." Kowalski had Harris halfway to the tree line before she'd finished the sentence. Park was moving Cole. Ortega had Yoon's hand and was talking to her, a constant low patter that Rachel caught fragments of. "You're okay, I've got you. Keep walking, that's good, that's good." And Yoon was walking, limping badly, but walking. Martinez wasn't. Martinez was unconscious. Had been for 11 minutes. Rachel turned back to the bird, to the litter where Martinez lay, and she did the math weight distance her left side, and she did what she always did, with math that came out wrong, which was ignore the answer and carry the litter anyway. Adeyemi appeared at her shoulder. "I've got the other end." She didn't argue. They moved. Israel. Minute 4, mini-climax. The extraction team, Israel 1, arrived in a truck that had seen considerably better decades, driven by a sergeant first class named Beaumont, who had a mustache in the demeanor of a man who had been surprised by exactly nothing for the last 20 years. He looked at the crashed helicopter. He looked at the 4 critical patients being arranged in the dirt. He looked at Rachel, who was standing upright through what appeared to be a combination of willpower and spite. And he said, "You, Donovan. Yeah, you look like hell. I've been told. What's your medic situation?" "Got one. She's good. I need 2. "I've got one." "Then she needs to work fast." Rachel turned to the woman Beaumont had indicated, Specialist Cho, 24 years old, and looking at the spread of patients with an expression of controlled panic that Rachel recognized and respected. She pointed. "Harris first. Vitash, episode 14 minutes ago I got him back, but his pressure is dropping. He needs a chest needle, left side current, IV in the right antecubital, push 2 liters, and get him on oxygen if you have it." Cho was already moving toward Harris before Rachel had finished. Good. That was what she needed. "Yoon," Rachel pointed. "Femoral tourniquet been on for 22 minutes. Document the time. She's conscious and oriented, but her pressure is low. You'll see it in her color. The tourniquet's tight, don't adjust it." "Got it." "Martinez is unconscious, CS of 6. When I last checked, mechanism was blast injury. You should assume TBI. She paused, pressed harder on her side, continued. "Cole has a chest wound, Park seal in place. He's been stable, keep him that way." Cho looked at her. "And you, Buckham?" "I'm standing." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer you're getting. Work." "Done." Minute 6. Beaumont had set up a perimeter, which was the right call, and his 4 men were positioned around the tree line, which was also the right call, and Rachel was beginning to reassess her initial read of him from inconvenient obstacle to actually competent. That happened sometimes. Kowalski found her while she was doing the mental accounting she always did after an action, who was where, what had been used, what still needed doing. He sat down on the ground next to her, not asking permission, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, "That man in the front, the one Adeyemi shot." "Yeah." "How did you know?" She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated and not especially satisfying. "I didn't, not for certain. But when something feels wrong and you wait for certainty, sometimes you wait too long. And if you'd been wrong, if they'd actually been extraction, then we'd be having a very different conversation and Adeyemi would have a lot of paperwork." She looked at him. "You did good today." He blinked, like the words had arrived in a language he was almost fluent in, but not quite. "I froze. For 3 seconds, then you unfroze." "I thought," he stopped. "What?" "I thought I was going to be the one who fell apart. I've thought that since before we left this morning. I've been thinking it for weeks, honestly. That when it actually happened, I was going to be the one who—" "You weren't," she said simply. "No." He looked at his hands, which had stopped shaking at some point that neither of them had marked. "No, I wasn't." Minute 8, audience retention hook. It was Reyes who found it. She'd been going through the helicopter salvaging what she could, equipment, radios, the black box, and she came back with an expression on her face that made Rachel's stomach drop before Reyes had said a single word. "Donovan, I need you to look at something." "What is it?" Reyes held up a device. Small military grade, the kind of thing that shouldn't have been in an American helicopter. A tracker. Magnetic. It had been attached to the underside of the port engine housing, which was also where the shrapnel damage was. "Which meant they knew where we'd be hit," Rachel said. "They didn't just shoot at us from the ridge. They placed this before we left." The weight of that settled over Rachel slowly and then all at once. Someone had been at FOB Kilo. Someone had been close enough to the flight line to put a tracking device on Dustoff 7 before it lifted off. Someone who knew the route, knew the timing, knew which bird they'd be taking. Someone on the inside. She took the device from Reyes and held it, and the cold clarity that had been keeping her functioning all day sharpened into something else entirely. Not just survival now, but something more complicated. A picture assembling itself from pieces she hadn't known were connected. "Khalid," she said. Reyes nodded. "He needs to know." "Get him." Shine. Minute 10. Khalid had gotten out of the cockpit under his own power, which she'd taken as a good sign, and he'd been quiet since then in the way pilots sometimes got after a crash, not shock exactly more, like a man doing a very thorough internal inventory. He came when Reyes called him, and he looked at the device in Rachel's hand, and his face did something that moved through several expressions before landing on a kind of grim certainty. "I found it at pre-flight," he said. Everyone went still. "I found it," he said again. "And I reported it to the duty officer at 0540. I was told it had been swept and cleared, that it was a standard telemetry device retrofitted by the maintenance crew, and I hadn't been notified." He looked at Rachel. "I should have grounded the bird. I've been sitting in that cockpit, telling myself I should have grounded the bird." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. "Who was the duty officer?" "Lieutenant Casper." She didn't know the name. She filed it. "You reported it through the chains," she said. "You did what you were supposed to do, and what comes next is above both our pay grades." She paused. "But it gets documented. Everything, the time, the conversation, the exact words. All of it. Already written in my flight log?" "Good." Adeyemi had been listening from 5 feet away, and he caught Rachel's eye. And she could see in his face that he was thinking the same thing she was thinking. This was not over when the helicopter landed. This was not even close to over. Minute 12, major twist. The radio came back to life. Not Beaumont's radio, not Reyes's. The small civilian frequency unit that Ortega had been carrying, the one he'd had at the original LZ, the one he'd brought aboard the helicopter without Rachel fully noting it. It crackled, and the voice that came out of it was the same voice from before. The same flat, deliberate English with an accent voice that had said, "Get her off my bird." "You made it further than expected," the voice said. "The tracker was a backup. You should know that." Rachel looked at the radio in Ortega's hand. Ortega was looking at it too with an expression that was absolutely unreadable. Beaumont was on his feet. His men had turned inward. "Who is this?" Rachel said. She took the radio from Ortega. He didn't resist, just let it go, and she pressed the transmit button. "Who is this?" "Someone who has been watching you for a long time, Sergeant Donovan. We knew you'd be on that bird. We knew your protocols. We knew your route." A pause. "We know the man you reported to 3 days ago. We know the call you made to your sister on Tuesday. We have been thorough." The coldness in her chest was different from the coldness of fear. It was the coldness of understanding that the problem was larger than the room you were standing in. "What do you want?" "Nothing from you. You've already given us what we needed." The line went dead. Rachel stared at the radio. Then she turned and looked at the faces around her. Kowalski, Adeyemi, Park Reyes, Cho Ortega, Beaumont, his 4 men, and she did something she had done 6,000 times in her career, which was take the chaos of a situation and find the single most actionable element within it. She pointed at Ortega. "Sit down," she said. "Okay." Minute 14 mini-climax. Ortega sat. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He sat down in the dirt the way a man sits when he has been waiting for something to happen, and it has finally happened, and there was something in his stillness that told Rachel more than any words could have. "How long?" she asked. He looked at the ground. "Sergeant, how long have they been running you?" A long silence, the kind that takes up all the oxygen in a space around them. Beaumont's men had tightened the perimeter, and Adeyemi had moved to a position where he could cover Ortega without being conspicuous about it, which meant he'd been watching Ortega for longer than Rachel had been. 6 months, Ortega said finally. His voice was very quiet. It had lost whatever professional competence it had carried all day, and what was underneath it was something younger and more broken. "They had my family, my mother and my brothers. He stopped, pressed his lips together. "They said if I helped them once, they'd let them go. And you believed that. I needed to believe that." Rachel crouched down in front of him. Her left side screamed at the movement, and she absorbed it and let it go. She looked at him, really looked the way she'd looked at Kowalski that morning, passed the uniform to the person behind it. He was 20 years old, maybe 21. He had done something unforgivable in service of something completely human. She didn't say any of that. She said, "Who did you contact? What did you give them? The route, the timing, the bird number?" He swallowed. "I didn't know they were going to. I thought it was intelligence. I didn't know they were going to try to bring the bird down." "You knew they were going to target me." He flinched. That was its own answer. Rachel stood up. She looked at Beaumont. "He goes back in custody. Separate vehicle, separate radio. Nothing he says or hears between here and Kilo." Beaumont nodded, no questions. Minute 16. Cho found her while Beaumont was arranging the transport. "Harris is stable," she said. "Pressure's coming up. I think you got to him in time." "And Yoon? She's going to need surgery on the leg, but she's going to keep it." Cho paused. "She keeps asking for you." Rachel walked over to where Yoon was lying on a stretcher, elevated warm now, under a foil blanket that made her look like something wrapped up carefully for safekeeping. Her eyes were open and tracking, and when she saw Rachel, she did something that made Rachel's chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with her left side. She held out her hand. Rachel took it. "I heard you running," Yoon said. "When you came to get me, I heard your boots, and I thought someone's coming. Someone's actually coming, and then you were there. You would have done the same." "I don't know that." "I do." Rachel squeezed her hand once and let it go. "You're going to be fine, specialist." "Yoon. Rama." Rachel said it the right way she'd heard it enough times from Ortega during the flight that the pronunciation had settled in. "You're going to be fine." And minute 18 audience retention hook / mini cliffhanger. Park appeared at her elbow with a field dressing and a look on her face that left no room for argument. "Let me see it." Rachel started to object. Park cut her off. "I have watched you hold your left side for 40 minutes, and I have not said anything because you would have fought me about it, and we didn't have the time. We have the time now." She held up the dressing. "Let me see it." Rachel lifted her hand. Park pulled back the jacket. There was a long silence. "You have 2 broken ribs," Park said. "Maybe 3. And something tore. Could be intercostal muscle, could be something worse. You need imaging." I need to get these patients loaded. They're being loaded. Beaumont's men aren't handling it. You need to stand here and let me put this dressing on, and then you need to tell me if it hurts to breathe deeply. Rachel breathed deeply. Something moved that shouldn't. Yes, she admitted. Okay. Park's voice dropped half a register. Okay, Sergeant. I need you to listen to me. You could have a pneumothorax. I don't think you do your colors okay and you're talking in complete sentences, but I need you to tell me the moment that changes, the moment it gets harder. You understand? I understand. I'm serious. I know you are. Park finished the dressing and straightened and said very quietly so that only Rachel could hear. For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much. Right now, what you did today was, don't, Rachel said. I'm going to. Park, it was extraordinary. Park said it simply without decoration, and then she stepped back and let Rachel be the person she needed to be, which was someone who was not yet finished. Minute 20, major twist resolution. The second truck arrived 7 minutes before the first was ready to leave, and the man who stepped out of it was wearing a rank that made Beaumont straighten and made Rachel's read of the day shift significantly. Colonel Diane Hart, Legal Affairs and Internal Investigations out of Command Headquarters. She was 52 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had spent her career arriving at places after the worst had happened and turning the aftermath into something usable. She looked at the crash site. She looked at the patients being loaded. She looked at Ortega in the back of the second truck, and then she looked at Rachel. Sergeant Donovan. Colonel, you're aware that Lieutenant Casper was relieved of duty approximately 35 minutes ago. Rachel kept her face still. I wasn't aware. He had a conversation this morning with someone who should not have had access to operational details. We've been building the case for 10 days. She paused. We knew there was an asset embedded with field teams in the Eastern Valley. We didn't know which team, which mission. Rachel let that sit for a moment. So we were bait. Hart's expression didn't change. You were never supposed to be in the air without additional escort. There was a failure in communication. 4 critical patients, a downed bird, a dead hostile, and a compromised medic. Rachel kept her voice very level. And a failure in communication. Yes. People almost died, Colonel Law. I know that. People almost died because someone up the chain made a decision about how much operational risk was acceptable without telling the people who were going to absorb that risk. I know that too. Hart looked at her steadily. That is why I am here. That is why this conversation is being recorded. And that is why your account of today's events, all of it, start to finish, will be the foundational document for what comes next. Rachel looked at her for a long time. There was a part of her that wanted to say more, that was building toward more, could feel the architecture of it rising in her chest alongside the broken ribs and whatever else Park was worried about. She let it go. Not forever. Just for now. You'll have my full statement, she said. I know I will. Hart nodded once. For what it's worth, what I've seen here today, what the ground team reported on the radio, when you were still in the air. She paused. Get your injuries treated, Sergeant. Minute 22. Kowalski was the last one to get into the truck. He'd been doing things helping load, helping Cho doing the 10,000 small tasks that needed doing after an action. Because if you stayed useful, you stayed functional. And if you stayed functional, you didn't have to feel everything all at once just yet. Rachel understood that mechanism completely because she had invented it. He stopped next to her before he climbed in. Sergeant Donovan? He said it the way he'd said it that morning back at the base, back when today was still in front of them. Something about the symmetry of it sat strangely in Rachel's chest. I have a question. Ask it. When you ran out to get Yoon, when the M240 went quiet and the north position opened up, he paused. You kept running. You didn't slow down. You just kept running. Yeah. How? She looked at him, at this kid who had unfrozen himself and carried a wounded woman across a fire-swept field and started an IV line in a pitching helicopter and held it together when everything was working very hard to make that impossible. Because she was still out there, Rachel said simply. That was the only math. He stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly like a man storing something away. Somewhere he'd be able to find it later. Get in the truck, Kowalski. He got in the truck. Rachel stood for one more second alone in the settling dust of the afternoon. Her hand pressed against her left side, the sound of rotors and gunfire still moving through her body like an aftershock. Her patience alive and moving and accounted for, every one of them. Then she climbed in after him. The truck ride back to Phoebe Kilo took 41 minutes, and Rachel was unconscious for 23 of them. She didn't know that until later. She found out from Kowalski, who told her in the same careful, factual tone he'd been using since the landing zone, the tone of a man who had decided that precise language was the only responsible option when describing something that had frightened him badly. He said she'd been talking, and then she'd stopped talking, and then she'd been listing to the left, and he'd caught her before she hit the side panel. He said he'd held her upright for the rest of the ride with one hand on her shoulder, because Park had both hands managing Harris's IV in the vehicle ahead, and there was nobody else. He said it like a report, but his jaw was tight the whole time he said it. Rachel listened and filed it and didn't make anything of it outwardly, because making something of it would have meant acknowledging the part she was still not ready to acknowledge, that the left side had been worse than she'd told Park, worse than she'd let herself process in the heat of the action, when processing it wasn't something she could afford. The ribs she'd known about. The other thing, the thing that had been quietly insisting on her attention since the helicopter hit the ground, that was something else. She found out what the something else was 2 hours later in the surgical bay at FOB Kilo, when the doctor, a Navy lieutenant commander named Vasquez, with tired eyes and the economical movements of someone who had been at this long enough to stop being theatrical about it, held up the imaging and said, "Splenic laceration, grade 2. You've been walking around with a grade 2 splenic laceration for approximately 3 hours. Is that bad?" Vasquez looked at her over the image. "It's not good." "Will I need surgery?" "Not immediately. Grade 2 we can manage conservatively if you stay completely still and completely off your feet and completely away from any situation that might—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider the trajectory of that sentence, given the person he was talking to, and adjusted. "You need bed rest, significant bed rest, the kind where you're actually in the bed. I have a debrief with Colonel Hart and Sergeant Donovan." He put the image down. "You have a lacerated spleen. The debrief can come to you." She started to argue. Then something shifted in her body, some last reserve that had been holding the argument in place, decided it had done enough for one day, and she lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and said, "Fine." Vasquez looked mildly alarmed, as if he'd been prepared for considerably more resistance. "Fine. Fine," she said again, "but I need to know the status of my patients first. All 4. He told her. Harris was in surgery. His heart had held the needle decompression, had done what it needed to do. The surgical team was optimistic. Yoon was in pre-op, the leg was survivable, the femoral had been caught in time. Martinez was out of surgery. The TBI was significant but not catastrophic. He was breathing on his own. Cole was in recovery. The chest wound had been clean, no secondary complications. 4 for 4. Rachel closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, Vasquez was watching her with an expression that had moved past professional into something more personal. "You kept all 4 of them alive," he said, "in a downed bird under fire with a grade 2 splenic laceration. I had help. That's what your team said about you." Minute 4 mini-climax. Tasha Williams arrived at 1900 still in her duty uniform, and she walked into the surgical bay the way Tasha walked everywhere, like she had a right to be there until proven otherwise. She pulled a chair up next to Rachel's bed, sat down without ceremony, and looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression that only people who know you very well can produce, the one that bypasses all the armor and goes directly to the part of you that's not performing. "I heard the radio traffic," she said, "from the moment you went in." Rachel didn't say anything. "I heard you call the approach. I heard the secondary attack. I heard—" Tasha stopped, reset. "When the fuel warning hit and Khalid called it in, I was standing at the radio with my hand over my mouth, and Captain Marsh was next to me, and he wasn't doing much better." Marsh. The man was gray. Rachel. The man was genuinely gray. Tasha shook her head. "He doesn't show that. I've seen him get casualty reports and eat a sandwich. He went gray." Rachel absorbed that. "How much do they know about Ortega? About Casper?" "Enough. Hart's team has been here since 1700. They've been in Marsh's office for 2 hours. Tasha's voice dropped. Word is Casper had been compromised for 8 months. Ortega was recruited 4 months ago. There are potentially 2 more assets unidentified in the Eastern Corridor. 2 more. That's what they're working on. Rachel stared at the ceiling. The thing that had been assembling itself since she'd heard the voice on the radio, "Get her off my bird, take her out first," was assembling further now, piece by piece, into a shape she didn't like looking at directly but couldn't stop looking at. "They knew my name," she said. The voice on the radio. They said my name. Not dust off Seven's crew, not the medical team. My name. Tasha was quiet. "That's not random targeting," Rachel said. "That's not an opportunistic hit on a Medevac. Someone built a file on me specifically." "I know. Which means either I've done something that made me a particular problem for them," or she paused, "or someone on our side built that file and gave it to them." Tasha looked at her hands. "Hart asked me about you, about your last 3 months. Routine movements, contacts, anything outside the normal pattern. And I told her everything I know, which is everything, because I'm your closest thing to a person in this hemisphere." Tasha looked up. She was very calm about it. That kind of calm that means she already knows something and she's checking it against what you're telling her. Rachel turned her head on the pillow. "Tasha, what aren't you telling me?" A long beat. Outside the base, somewhere down the corridor, someone was being moved on a gurney and the wheels needed oiling, and the sound was irregular and rhythmic and wrong. "Your name came up in the Casper intercepts," Tasha said finally. "Not as a target, as a reason. The phrase they found was, 'She's the keystone.' They said it twice on 2 separate communications." The keystone. Rachel didn't speak for a moment. She was measuring the word, its weight, its implication. A keystone holds an arch together. Remove it and the whole structure comes down. "They think if I go down, the team falls apart," she said. "That's one interpretation. What's the other one?" Tasha met her eyes. "That you know something they don't want you to know, and you don't know you know it." Minute 8 audience retention hook. Hart came at 2100 alone without the junior officers who had been flanking her at the extraction site. She pulled the same chair Tasha had used, sat in it, the same weight directly, no performance, and put a folder on the bed beside Rachel's hand. "Don't open that yet," she said. "What is it?" Background on the voice from the radio. She folded her hands. "His name is Yusuf Moran. He's a former intelligence officer. Our intelligence officer, or he was until 4 years ago when he was reported killed in action in an operation that was subsequently classified at a level I'm still fighting to access." She paused. "He wasn't killed. That much we're certain of. What happened in the 18 months between his reported death and his reappearance we're working on." Rachel looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "And his connection to me. 18 months ago, you filed an after-action report on a mission in the Western Sector. A Medevac where you reported suspicious activity near the flight line. A device you thought you saw on one of the support vehicles." Rachel remembered. She had filed it. She'd been told it was a maintenance transponder. She had accepted to that. She had moved on. The device was consistent with early generation tracking technology that has since been linked to Moran's network, Hart said. "Your report was the first documentation of that technology appearing on a U.S. installation. If it had been investigated properly at the time," she stopped. "It wasn't investigated," Rachel said. "It was buried. By someone. We don't know who yet." Hart looked at her steadily. "You saw something 18 months ago that you didn't know you were seeing. And Moran knows you filed that report because someone showed it to him. And somewhere in his calculus that makes you a liability." Rachel processed this slowly. Her left side pulsed with her heartbeat steady and insistent. "All of this," she said. "Today, 4 critical patients, a downed bird Ortega, the fake extraction team, was primarily an attempt to prevent you from making it back to a base where Colonel Hart was already building a case." Hart said it without flinching. "You were the mission sergeant. The wounded were secondary, terrible as that is to say." The silence after that statement had a texture to it, rough and heavy, the kind you could feel on your skin. "The patients," Rachel said carefully. "If I had been the only objective, the patients they were leverage and cover, and incidentally real human beings whose lives you saved in spite of everything." Hart leaned forward slightly. "I want to be very clear about this. The fact that you held your mission focus, that you prioritized those 4 people, even knowing you were being targeted, specifically that is documented. It is witnessed and it is not lost on anyone in this command. Rachel looked at the ceiling again. She was trying to find the place inside herself where she put things that were too large to fully process in the moment the shelf she'd been building for 14 years, the one that was getting crowded. What happens now, she said, now you recover. And then we talk extensively about Moran and about everything you remember from 18 months ago and about anything else that surfaces. Hart stood. Open the folder when you're ready, or not tonight, it can wait until morning. She left. Rachel looked at the folder. She didn't open it. Not yet. Minute 10 mini climax. Kowalski came back at 2200. She heard him before she saw him, that particular cadence of someone trying to walk quietly and not quite managing it. He appeared in the doorway of the bay, saw she was awake, and had the expression of a man who hadn't fully planned what came after finding out she was awake. You can come in, she said. He came in. He didn't take the chair. He stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets in a posture that reminded her for a strange second of the way he had stood outside the aid station that morning before all of it. A different lifetime's distance from here. Harris is out of surgery, he said. I know. Vasquez told me. He's going to make it. They said another 10 minutes and... He stopped. But it wasn't another 10 minutes, Rachel said. It was exactly the time we had. He nodded. Then, can I ask you something? You've been asking me things all day, Kowalski. You don't need to announce it. When they said your name on the radio, when the voice said your name specifically, and you told me to keep pressure on the dressing. He looked at her. Were you scared? She considered the question. She'd been asked versions of it before by junior personnel, by reporters, once by her mother years ago in a phone call that had started as a check-in and become something much more. She'd given different answers at different times, some more true than others. Yes, she said, not the way you're scared in a firefight where it's immediate and physical and your body just takes over. This was colder. This was the kind of scared where your brain understands the full picture and processes exactly how bad it is. She paused. Which is worse, honestly, the hot kind you can outrun, the cold kind you have to carry. How do you carry it? Same way you carried Yoon across that field. You put one foot in front of the other and you don't look at the whole distance. You look at the next step. He was quiet for a moment. I keep replaying it. That's normal. In the helicopter, when the port engine hit, I thought I should be doing something, and I didn't know what, and I felt completely useless, Rachel said. He blinked. Yeah. And then you looked around and you found something useful, and you did it. He thought back. I repositioned Harris's litter towards center. Like Reyes said, you did, without being told, while being actively terrified. She looked at him. That's not useless, Kowalski. That's what the job actually looks like from the inside. Nobody tells you that in training, because if they told you, that half of you would quit. He almost smiled again. It made it further than it had that morning, almost to his eyes this time. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to sure is full of people asking you questions. Yes, Sergeant. He turned to go, stopped. For what it's worth, and I know I'm like the 5th person today who said something like this, so feel free to tell me to shut up. I won't. He searched for the word and couldn't find one that was big enough, and so he settled for something smaller and more honest. You kept us all here. Rachel let that land, didn't deflect it, didn't minimize it. Let it land the way it was meant to, which was sincerely from a 22-year-old kid who had been afraid and had done it anyway and was trying to say thank you in the only language he currently had available. Good night, Private, she said. He left. And for a moment, the bay was quiet in a way that FOB Kilo almost never was, and Rachel lay in that quiet and breathed carefully around the broken ribs and the lacerated spleen and the cold fear she was still carrying, and felt, underneath all of it, something that wasn't quite peace, but was in the same neighborhood. Minute 14, major twist. She opened the folder at 2300 when the bay had quieted and the night corpsman had done his round, and the only sound was the distant machinery of a base that never fully slept. The first 3 pages were what Hart had described Marin's service record, his reported death, the classified notation that meant the real story was somewhere else. She read them carefully, she absorbed them. The 4th page was different. It was a communication log, intercepted, translated 3 months old. It was between Moran and an unidentified contact within the U.S. military structure. The unidentified contact had a code designation, Anchor. Anchor had provided Moran with Rachel's personal file, service record commendations, psychological evaluations next of kin. Rachel read through it and felt her skin doing something she associated with real danger. Not battlefield danger, but the specific danger of understanding that someone had looked at every part of her life with the intent to use it. Then she reached the last item on the page and everything slowed down. Anchor had also provided the names and locations of Rachel's next of kin, her mother, her younger brother in Phoenix, her sister in San Diego, the one she'd called on Tuesday, the one the voice on the radio had mentioned, the one who had 2 kids and a house on a cul-de-sac and a husband who coached Little League, and absolutely no context for any of this. Her sister's address was in the file. Rachel sat up in bed, which hurt, and she didn't care. She reached for the buzzer and pressed it, and when the night corpsman appeared, she said, "I need to reach Colonel Hart right now, tonight." "Sergeant, it's right now to..." She said it in the voice she'd used at the LZ at the helicopter door. On the ground with Ortega, the voice that was not loud but was absolute. "Get her on the radio, or get her on the phone, or wake her up, in person, I don't care which. But I need her now." Minute 16 mini-climax. Hart arrived in 14 minutes still in uniform, which suggested she hadn't been asleep. She looked at Rachel's face and then at the open folder, and she understood immediately. "You saw the contact list. My sister's address is in that file, Colonel." Rachel kept her voice steady through an effort she was acutely aware of. "With the names of her children. My nephew is 8 years old. My niece is 6. I know." "Do they know? Protective custody was arranged 4 hours ago. Your sister was contacted by agents at 1940. Her family is safe." Hart sat down. "I should have told you that before I left the folder. That was a failure on my part, and I'm sorry." Rachel absorbed their apology. It was real, she could hear that it was real, and she let it do what it was supposed to do, which was partially close the distance between what had happened and what she needed to be able to function going forward. "How long has Anchor been in contact with Moran?" "At least 16 months. Possibly longer." 16 months. Rachel did the arithmetic. "That's before my after-action report." "Yes." "So they were already inside before I reported the device?" "Yes." "Which means my report was intercepted, flagged, buried, and shared with Moran before it could be investigated." Hart's voice was even. "You triggered something by seeing what you saw, and it would have been better for Moran and for Anchor if you hadn't come home from today's mission." The full picture assembled itself completely, and finally in Rachel's mind, all the pieces she'd been carrying since the radio crackled with her name, and she saw it whole, and it was exactly as bad as the cold fear had been telling her it was. She had been a loose end for 16 months without knowing it. Everything today had been designed to tie it off. "Anchor," she said, "how close are you to an identification?" Hart was very still. "Closer than we were this morning. Because of today. Because you survived today, and because Ortega is talking." She paused. "And because Lieutenant Casper, when he was confronted with the intercept evidence this afternoon, chose cooperation over silence." "Did he give you a name?" The longest pause yet, the kind that meant yes, but complicated. "He gave us a rank," Hart said. "We're working on the name." Rachel looked at her. What rank? Hart met her eyes. Senior enough to bury an after-action report. Senior enough to approve operational routes without secondary oversight. Senior enough to know which bird you'd be on this morning. The word colonel existed in the silence between them without being spoken by either of them. "Not me," Hart said quietly, "in case you're doing the math." "I know it's not you," Rachel said. "You would have been considerably more careful about what you left in a folder." Something moved in Hart's expression that might, in a different context, have been amusement. "Get some rest, Sergeant. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Colonel," Rachel stopped her at the door. "The people on that bird today, Kowalski, Adeyemi, Park, Reyes, Khalid, They need to know they're going to be protected. Whatever comes out of this investigation, whatever exposure there is, they were doing their jobs in good faith and they deserve. Already arranged, Hart said. All of them are being briefed in the morning. All of them are covered. She paused. You train good people, Sergeant. Rachel didn't have an answer for that. Hart left. Minute 20 audience retention hook. She should have slept. Vasquez had told her to sleep. Tasha had told her to sleep. Her body was making a compelling and sustained argument for sleep. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and she thought about Moran's voice on the radio. She thought about the way he'd said her name or implied it said she as if she were a problem he'd been working on for a while and was slightly surprised to still be working on. She thought about the tracker on the helicopter. She thought about Kowalski catching her eye of line when it had pulled in the turbulence and resecuring it without being told. She thought about Yoon holding out her hand. She thought about the after-action report she'd filed 18 months ago. She'd almost not filed it. She'd thought about it, but it was probably nothing, thought she'd look paranoid, thought the maintenance crew would have an explanation, and she'd feel foolish for wasting paper on it. And then she'd filed it anyway because she had a rule about herself that she'd developed over 3 deployments. And that rule was if you see something that makes the back of your neck feel wrong, you write it down. Even if it turns out to be nothing, especially if it turns out to be nothing. That report had made her a target. It had also apparently made her essential to taking that target apart. She didn't know how to feel about that. Both things were true simultaneously, and they didn't resolve into something comfortable when you held them together. They just sat there, both true, both heavy, both hers. The folder was still open on the bed beside her. She looked at the last page again, not at the contact list this time, but at the section below it that she'd read quickly the first time. A timeline of Moran's documented communications with Anchor. 16 months of them. Dates, rough locations, operational details she didn't have clearance to fully understand. But one date stopped her. 3 weeks ago, a communication in which Anchor had told Moran that a new mission rotation had been approved. Eastern Valley, Medevac, and a name not Rachel's full name. Just the last name, Donovan. She's been scheduled. Scheduled, not assigned, not deployed, scheduled, like an appointment, like something on a calendar. She had been put on this mission by someone who knew what was waiting for her. She sat with that for a long time, the dark of the bay around her, the distant sounds of the base moving through its night cycle, the soft beeping of her monitoring equipment keeping time. Then she picked up the pen on the bedside table and the notepad Hart had left, and she began to write. Not the official statement that would come later with lawyers and investigators and recorded devices. This was something different. This was the things she remembered in the order she remembered them starting 18 months ago, with a device she'd seen on a support vehicle and a report she'd almost not filed. She wrote for 2 hours. Her left side ached through all of it. She wrote anyway. At 0200, Adeyemi appeared in the doorway. She looked up. Couldn't sleep either, she said. No, Sergeant. He came in and took the chair. He looked at the notepad in her hand. What are you doing? Well, I'm building a record. He nodded slowly. Can I help? She looked at him, at this man who had fired the shot that had kept them all alive, who had moved without hesitation, who had been watching Ortega before she had, whose instincts had been operating on a frequency she trusted completely. Tell me what you noticed, she said. Everything, from the first briefing this morning. Tell me what felt wrong and when it started feeling that way. He settled into the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he started to talk, and Rachel wrote it all down. Adeyemi talked until 0400, and Rachel wrote until her hand cramped. And by the time they were finished, the notepad had 31 pages of small, tight handwriting that covered everything from the pre-mission briefing to the moment Beaumont's truck cleared the extraction site. Adeyemi had a memory that worked like a camera, not photographic exactly, but precise in the way of a person who had learned early that the details nobody else bothered to remember were often the ones that mattered most. He remembered the exact phrasing Captain Marsh had used when describing the new landing zone. He remembered which radio the duty officer had been standing next to when Khalid reported the device at pre-flight. He remembered that Ortega had arrived at the original LZ 17 minutes before the estimated window, which meant he'd left the forward position early, which meant he'd known the mission timeline before it was officially transmitted. That last detail made Rachel stop writing. He left early, she said. 17 minutes. Adeyemi held up his fingers like he was counting the certainty of it. I clocked it because I clock arrival times. It's a habit. I don't always know why I clock them until later. You told Hart. I told Hart's investigator at 1830. She wrote it down and did not react, which means she already knew, or she was very good at not reacting. Both probably. Rachel looked at the page in front of her. 17 minutes early. He needed to be there before us, to position himself, to make sure the radio was accessible. She set the pen down. Her fingers were stiff. Did you trust him before today? Ortega. Adeyemi thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. I didn't distrust him, which isn't the same thing. He was competent. He was quiet in a way that I read as professional, but could also have been something else. He paused. I think I wanted to read it as professional because the alternative was uncomfortable. It's always uncomfortable, Rachel said. That's how it works. They choose people who fit in well enough that discomfort feels like your own failure of generosity. Adeyemi looked at her. Is that from experience or from training? Both. She closed the notepad. Go sleep 2 hours at least. And you thought, I'll sleep when the sun comes up. She said it in a way that meant she probably wouldn't, and they both knew it, and he left anyway because he understood as people who work closely with someone eventually do that. There are battles worth picking and battles worth walking away from. Minute 4, mini climax. The sun came up at 06:12 and Rachel was still awake, and Vasquez found her sitting up in bed with the folder reassembled and the notepad closed on top of it, and an expression on her face that he would later describe to a colleague as the look of someone who has been very far away and has just reluctantly agreed to come back. He checked her vitals without commenting on the lack of sleep. He checked the imaging he'd ordered overnight. The laceration was stable, which was the best news available, and he said in the tone of a man recalibrating his expectations in real time, how bad is the pain this morning? Manageable. On a scale. 5, maybe 6. When you were moving, she met his eyes. 7. He wrote something down. I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it not as a recommendation but as a medical fact. If you re-injure the spleen, if you do something that escalates the laceration from a grade 2 to a grade 3 or higher, the conversation about surgery becomes significantly less optional and significantly more urgent. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're telling me I'm not invincible. I'm telling you that you have been operating as though you are, and today the math on that needs to change. He looked at her over the notepad. I'm also telling you that your patients are all stable this morning. Harris is in recovery. Yoon came through surgery. Martinez is awake and asking questions. Cole ate breakfast. He paused. I thought you'd want to know. She did. She let that information do what it needed to do, which was settle somewhere deep and solid underneath everything else. Thank you, she said. She meant it entirely. Minute 6. Hart's formal debrief began at 0800 in the conference room adjoining the command post, and Rachel attended it in a wheelchair that she had argued against and lost pushed by a corpsman named Del Vecchio, who had the particular patience of someone who had been briefed on what kind of patient he was dealing with. The conference room held 7 people. Hart. 2 investigators. Rachel didn't know. Marsh, who looked like he hadn't slept either, and who met Rachel's eyes when she came in with an expression that was more complicated than she'd expected from a man who ate sandwiches during casualty reports, Khalid Reyes, and a JAG officer named Captain Ferrara, who was there to ensure everything proceeded in a manner that would survive legal scrutiny. The debrief took 4 hours. Rachel talked for most of it. She talked through everything: the morning, the approach, the LZ, the false extraction team, the radio, Ortega, the tracker, the crash, the ride back. She talked through it in order and without ornamentation, and when she got to the part about the folder and her sister's address, she watched Ferrara write something in a very controlled way that told her this was going to matter in a courtroom eventually. Khalid talked about the device he'd found at pre-flight. He had the conversation log timestamp, exact words exchanged with the duty officer who had cleared it. He had it memorized. When he recited it, the room was very quiet. Reyes talked about the helicopter, about the port engine, about the shrapnel pattern, which she had photographed before leaving the crash site, and which told a story about the angle of the attack and the position of the shooter that she laid out with the confidence of someone who understood machinery the way other people understood language. At 11:40, Ferrara put his pen down and looked at Hart. The communication log, the Casper confession, the Ortega deposition, and the testimony in this room, that's a viable case. Against Moran, Hart said. Against Moran. Against the network and against Anchor. Whoever Anchor turns out to be. He paused. The rank Casper provided narrows it to 6 individuals with the level of access required. 4 of them have alibi documentation for relevant time windows that would take months to disprove. The remaining 2, he stopped. He looked at Hart. Rachel looked at Hart. Hart said, one of the remaining 2 submitted a leave request this morning at 05:30 before the debrief was scheduled. The room absorbed that. Marsh said very quietly, who? Hart said the name. Rachel didn't recognize it. She watched Marsh's face and she watched. Something happened there that she'd never seen on him before and didn't have a clean word for it. Was the look of a man confronting the specific betrayal of someone he'd trusted. Not with his life, necessarily, but with his judgment, which in some ways is harder to recover from. I authorized his access to the mission rotation 6 weeks ago, Marsh, but you couldn't have known, Hart said. I authorized it. He said it again, not to argue with her, just to be precise. To own it in the exact shape it was. Rachel recognized that impulse. She had done the same thing many times with many different failures. The precision of accountability, the refusal to let it blur into excuse. Is he in custody? So she asked. As of 0700, Hart said, he presented the leave request digitally from on base. We had him before he reached the gate. Minute 10 major twist / audience retention hook. The debrief wrapped at noon and Rachel was wheeled back to the surgical bay and Vasquez checked her again. And she ate something that was described on the tray as chicken, but had made its peace with ambiguity. And at 1300, Tasha came back. She didn't sit down this time. She stood in the doorway for a second and Rachel looked at her and knew immediately that something had moved. What happened? Rachel said, not a question. Moran made contact. Tasha came in and closed the door behind her. Not through a radio, not through a cut frequency. He made contact through the base's internal communication network, through a terminal in the Eastern Barracks that requires a valid military ID to access. Rachel sat very still. He's on the base. Was on the base. Hart's team found the terminal at 1240. Security footage has a figure in uniform entering the barracks at 0900 and leaving at 0917. Face partially obscured. They're running the footage now. Tasha's voice was careful and controlled in the way that meant she was doing active work to keep it that way. He sent one message to one recipient. Who? You. The word landed in the room like something physical. Rachel felt her heart do one hard beat and then settle back into its rhythm. Discipline. Refusing to be hijacked. What did it say? She asked. Tasha pulled out her phone. She'd photographed the message original language in translation. She handed it to Rachel. The message was 8 words. You filed the report. I'll remember that, Donovan. Rachel read it twice. She handed the phone back. He came onto this base. She said, walked to a terminal and sent me a message while we were in a formal debrief 40 meters away. Yes. To tell me he knows I filed the report. Yes. Which I already knew he knew. She paused. Which means the message isn't information. It's a statement. He's telling me he's still here, that he can still reach me, that what happened yesterday didn't finish anything. She looked at Tasha. He's scared. Tasha blinked. Most people would read that as a threat. It is a threat. It's also evidence of fear. A man who has the advantage doesn't announce himself. A man who feels the ground shifting under him does. Rachel handed the phone back. He was on this base this morning and he left without being caught, which means he has at least one more asset we haven't identified. But he needed me to know he was here. He needed the psychological ground of my knowing. That's not confidence. That's a man who is running out of other tools. Tasha stared at her. You've been awake for 31 hours with a lacerated spleen, and you are conducting psychological analysis of the man who tried to kill you. Would you prefer I do something else with the time? I would prefer you sleep. I'll sleep when this is finished. You keep saying that. And yet here we are. Minute 14. Mini climax. Hart came back at 1400 and she had the security footage on a tablet, and Rachel watched on 17 seconds of a figure in uniform moving through a corridor, and she watched it 3 times, and the third time she said, "Stop it there." Hart stopped it. Rachel looked at the frame. The figure was almost fully obscured, head down, cap low, the practiced non-presence of a person who knew where the cameras were. But at the moment the figure turned left into the barracks corridor, there was a half-second of profile, just the jaw, just the angle of the ear. "I've seen him," Rachel said. Hart looked at her sharply. "Not recently. Not here." Rachel kept looking at the frozen frame. "He was at the Western Sector installation. 18 months ago. I didn't know his name. There was a man who I'd noticed because he was near the vehicle with the device. I filed that in the report. I said I'd seen someone near the vehicle. I described him as a Western contractor, middle-aged, short hair, a specific way of holding his hands when he walked behind his back, right hand over left wrist." She looked at the figure's hands in the frozen frame. Right hand, left wrist. Hart saw it in the same second Rachel said it. "That's him," Rachel said. "That's Moran." The room between the two of them contracted. Hart was already on her radio pulling people coordinates descriptions, the specific quality of her voice going from professional to something faster and more direct. Rachel watched her work and felt something shift internally. The investigation that had been happening around her to her about her was becoming something she was now inside of in a different way. Her memory had just become the most important thing in the building. On minute 16. They spent the next 2 hours going through the after-action report Rachel had filed 18 months ago, line by line. Hart on one side of the bed, and an investigator named Torres on the other, with Rachel reconstructing everything she remembered. From that day, what she'd seen in what sequence, the vehicle, the device, the man with his hands behind his back. She remembered more than she thought she would. That happens sometimes. The brain kept things it didn't tell you. It was stored them in some back room. And when you finally needed them, they were there, slightly dusty but intact. She remembered the time of day, the angle of the light. The vehicle was a support utility truck and with a particular dent in the rear quarter panel on the driver's side. She remembered that the device was attached to the underside of the rear axle, not the engine, which was different from the tracker on Dustoff 7, which meant either the technology had evolved or the operational context was different. She remembered that the man had looked at her once directly, briefly, with eyes that were doing a calculation, and then looked away, and she had thought in that moment, "He knows I saw." And she had been right, apparently, in ways she was only now fully understanding. Torres was recording everything. He had the kind of focused energy of a person who had spent years waiting for a case to crack open and was watching it happen in real time. At 1600, he looked up from his notes and said, "The vehicle with the dent. I need to find that vehicle." Western Sector motor pool records, Rachel said. 18 months ago, it would have been in the rotation log. The dent was significant enough to have been noted in maintenance records. It was structural, not cosmetic. "You know vehicle maintenance records?" "I know everything that touches the operational picture," she said. "It's the joke." He nodded and excused himself and came back 38 minutes later with a look on his face that was the investigative equivalent of a mini-climax control, but barely. "Vehicle is in records. Decommissioned 14 months ago, logged out to a contractor disposal company." He paused. "The disposal company does not appear to exist." Hart, who had been on a call in the corner, turned around. "Say that again." "The company that took the vehicle. It's a shell, 3 layers deep, but our financial team pulled it in 20 minutes because the registration address was a parking garage in a city that doesn't have the zip code the form lists." He paused again. "The vehicle was taken 11 weeks after Sergeant Donovan filed her report." 11 weeks. Rachel calculated backward. 11 weeks after she'd filed the report, someone had made the vehicle, the evidence, disappear, which meant Anchor had been active and responsive and protecting Moran's network for at least that long, probably longer. "They move fast," she said. "Because you saw clearly," Hart said, "because your report was precise enough to be a problem. The device description, the vehicle, the physical description of the individual, it was enough to run with if it had been run with. Instead, it was buried and the evidence was removed." "Yes." Rachel looked at the ceiling. She was thinking about a version of 18 months ago in which someone had taken her report seriously. in which an investigation had started then, in which the network had been identified and dismantled before it could schedule her death on a Medevac mission in the Eastern Valley. She thought about Harris and his pneumothorax and Yoon and her leg and Kowalski frozen on the helicopter floor for 3 seconds. And she thought about all of it branching from a report that had been filed and buried on the same day. She did not let herself stay in that version of events long. It was unproductive. What mattered was now. "What do you need from me next?" she said. Minute 20 major twist/audience retention hook. What Hart needed, it turned out, was not something she'd anticipated. At 17:30, Hart came back alone. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and she was quiet for a moment in a way that had weight to it, the silence of someone organizing something difficult. "Moran sent a second message," she said. Rachel waited. "Not to you this time, to Hart's personal command email, which is classified and should be inaccessible to anyone outside of a very specific authorization level." Hart's voice was very even. "He knows we have Anchor. He knows Anchor is in custody. He is offering information about the broader network, about other operations, about individuals we have not yet identified in exchange for one condition." "What condition?" "He wants to speak with you." The room was very still. "Not with investigators," Hart said. "Not with legal. Not with me. He specified you by name and rank, and he specified in person, which our security people are already categorically refusing. But he left open the option of immediate communication monitored, recorded with his position, untraceable." Rachel said nothing for a moment. She was running the calculation that she always ran. What does this serve? What does this cost? What is the shape of the thing underneath the stated request? "He wants to talk to me," she said slowly, "because I'm the one who saw him 18 months ago. I'm the only person alive who can place him at that location and at that time, in that proximity to a device that connects him to a chain of operations." She paused. "He wants to know what I remember. He's offering information in exchange for the chance to figure out exactly how much I have on him." Hart was looking at her with an expression that confirmed she was right. "If I talk to him, he learns where the gaps are," Rachel said. "He learns what we can prove and what we can't." "Yes. And if I don't talk to him, we lose whatever he's offering, which may be substantial or may be carefully curated to protect what matters most to him." Hart folded her hands. "This is your call, Sergeant. Fully and completely your call. I want that on record before you answer." Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll talk to him." Hart's expression didn't change. "I anticipated that." "I know, but you wanted me to decide it myself." "Yes." "I want Adeyemi in the room when it happens, not for protection, because he remembers details I don't, and I want someone I trust listening for the things I'm not positioned to hear." Hart nodded. "Tonight, if he accepts the terms." "He'll accept." Rachel shifted against the pillow. Her side pulsed. She ignored it. "He sent that message because he's running. The network is compromised. Anchor is in custody, the vehicle is traced, and someone who saw his face 18 months ago just survived a mission designed to keep her from ever saying so. He is calculating losses, and he is trying to stop the bleeding." She looked at Hart directly. "He's going to call tonight, and I'm going to let him think he's getting what he needs. And he's going to give us something real in exchange because he needs it to be a real negotiation. And when he does, you're going to use it." Hart considered her. "You understand this is not a simple conversation. I've been having complicated conversations for 14 years. This is different from—" "I know what it's different from." Rachel said it simply without edge. "I know what I'm walking into. I'm walking in anyway." Minute 22. Kowalski found out about the call at 1800 from Adeyemi, who had been told by Rachel, who had decided he deserved to know the shape of what was happening. He found her in the bay at 1820 with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him yet. Not the fear from the helicopter, not the reckoning from the truck. Something that sat between anger and protectiveness and was clearly looking for somewhere to land. "You're going to talk to him," he said. "Yes. The man who told his people to specifically target you. That's the one. And you think this is—" "It's necessary," she said. "I know what it looks like from where you're standing. I know it looks like walking back towards something that just tried to kill you. But Kowalski, he's going to talk to me because he thinks I'm the thread he can pull to unravel what we have. And we're going to let him think that, and while he's pulling, he's going to show us exactly where the fabric is weakest. That's how this works. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and Rachel recognized the specific frustration of someone who wants to argue but cannot find the argument, which means they know you're right and they don't like it. I want to be there, he said. Adeyemi's going to be there. I want to be there too. She looked at him for a long moment. He'd started an IV line in a pitching helicopter. He'd carried a wounded soldier across open ground under fire. He'd unfrozen himself when it counted. Talk to Hart, she said. He blinked. Really? If she clears it, I won't object. But it's her room and her protocol and her call. He was gone in under a minute. Rachel almost smiled. Minute 24, mini-climax. The call came at 2100 as she'd said it would. It came through a routing system that Hart's technical people had been building since 1900, and they had exactly the kind of setup that made Rachel feel both reassured and aware of how precisely Moran had predicted their preparations. He'd specified terms that accommodated a monitored call, which meant he'd anticipated the monitoring, which meant everything he said would be calculated to accommodate that fact. She kept that at the front of her mind when the connection opened. His voice was the same as the radio, not exactly calm, that would have been too simple a word. Settled. The voice of a man who has reached a point where anxiety requires more energy than he's willing to spend on it. Sergeant Donovan. No preamble. Moran. She used his name deliberately. She watched Adeyemi in the corner, noting, listening. Kowalski was against the wall, still enough to be furniture. Hart was in the next room on a linked feed. You survived yesterday, Marin said. I want you to know that was not... I'm not interested in your feelings about yesterday, Rachel said. You reached out. You offered information. Tell me what you are offering. A pause. She could almost feel him recalibrating, adjusting for a version of her that was more direct than he'd modeled. There are 11 active operations in the Eastern Corridor that your command is currently unaware of. 2 of them involve personnel at the general officer level. I can provide names, dates, and transaction records. In exchange for immunity and your testimony that you cannot positively identify me from the footage taken at the Western installation. There it was. That was the thing. He didn't want her to say she saw him. She let him wait for exactly 4 seconds. Tell me about the general officer level operations. Another pause. Longer. You want specifics before you agree. I want to know if what you're offering is real. He spoke for 11 minutes. The information was real. She could see it in Torres's face on the monitor link, see the almost involuntary response of a man hearing things he recognized as accurate. She held her own face neutral and let Moran talk, and she asked precise questions, and she listened to every answer and to everything underneath every answer. And at the end of 11 minutes, she said, I'll need to consult with Colonel Hart. Of course, his voice was careful now, measuring. The identification question, Sergeant. I heard your question, she said. And she looked at the wall in front of her. She thought about the frozen frame on the tablet, the jaw, the ear, the hands right over left. She thought about the after-action report she'd almost not filed. She thought about her sister's children's names in a dossier assembled by a man who had been building leverage against her for over a year. I remember exactly what I saw, she said. I remember it with complete clarity. The silence on the other end lasted a long time. Then Moran said very quietly, I see. And Rachel said, I think you're beginning to. The line stayed open. Neither of them spoke. In the corner, Adeyemi had stopped writing and was simply watching her, and on his face was the expression of a man watching something he will remember for the rest of his life. Not the action, not the danger, but the absolute stillness of a person who knows exactly what she has and exactly what it costs and is choosing to spend it anyway. The call was still open. Moran was still there, and Rachel sat with the weight of everything she remembered, and she did not flinch. The line stayed open for 4 more minutes after Rachel's last words, and in those 4 minutes, nobody in the room moved. Adeyemi's pen was still. Kowalski had stopped breathing in any way that was audible. The technical monitor that Torres was watching cast a pale light across his face, and he did not blink. Moran broke the silence first. That mattered. Rachel noted it the way she noted everything cleanly, without commentary filed for later. You understand, he said slowly, that your identification places you in a position of personal exposure. People who testify against networks like mine tend to find that the network has a long reach and a longer memory. You already put my sister's address in a file, Rachel said. You already reached into my personal life from a distance of several thousand miles. You already tried to bring down the helicopter. I was on. She kept her voice at the same level it had been all, calm, not cold, not hot, just absolutely present. You have already done your worst, and I am still here talking to you. So if the point of that statement was to make me afraid it's a few days late, another silence, shorter this time. The two general officer names, Murren said, I'll give you one tonight, the second when my terms are confirmed in writing. Rachel looked at the wall where she knew the feed to Hart's room was running. She gave it 1 second. Then give me the first name. He gave it. She watched Torres across the room write it down and then sit back from the desk like the name had physical weight. She watched him look at Hart's door. She kept her face neutral. Colonel Hart will have paperwork to you within 24 hours, Rachel said. Don't contact me again directly. Go through the formal channel she establishes. Sergeant Donovan, we're done for tonight. She reached over and ended the call herself. Her hand was completely steady. She held that steadiness for exactly the time it took everyone in the room to look at her, and then she set the handset down and exhaled once slowly through her nose, and the thing she'd been holding for the last 31 minutes, the structure of absolute composure she'd built around the conversation, the way you build a temporary wall around something dangerous, she let it down, quietly, just enough. Adeyemi said nothing. He closed his notebook and held it in both hands like something he was carrying carefully. Kowalski said from the wall, Did that just, yes, Rachel said, it worked. He exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a word. She understood it completely. Minute 4 mini-climax. Hart came through the door 90 seconds later, and she had the contained energy of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing for a very long time and has just seen it arrive. She stood in the center of the room, and she looked at Rachel, and for a moment, just a moment, the colonel disappeared. And there was just a woman who understood what had happened and what it had cost. The name he gave, Hart said, we've had it on a secondary watch list for 7 months, unconfirmed. What he gave us tonight makes it confirmable. Will it hold, Rachel asked. With your testimony and the communication logs and what Casper and Ortega have already given us, yes, it will hold. Hart paused. You understood that he was going to try to use the call to gauge your memory. Yes. And you let him hear exactly enough to confirm that your memory is complete and precise. Which it is. Hart agreed. So now he knows that refusing to cooperate fully leaves him exposed to a witness who can place him at the Western installation with specificity. And cooperating fully gives him immunity terms that are significantly less generous than he believes they are. Rachel looked at her. How less generous? Immunity from prosecution in this jurisdiction, which is real. It simply doesn't address the 4 other jurisdictions where his activities have generated active warrants. Hart's expression was precise. He will figure that out eventually. By then we will have everything he can give us. Rachel absorbed that. She'd suspected something in this shape, had suspected it from the moment Hart said fully your call with the particular emphasis of someone covering the record. She didn't object to it. She sat with the ethics of it for a moment, honestly, and without performance. And she decided that a man who had put her sister's children's names in an operational file was a man for whom the available sympathy was limited. Get some sleep, Hart said. Tomorrow you give your formal, recorded testimony, and then I want you transported to a proper medical facility. Vasquez has been extraordinarily patient, but he is not equipped for the follow-up care you're going to need. Harris, Rachel said immediately. Yun Martinez, call their transfer status. All 4 are being coordinated through the same transport. You'll go together. Hart allowed herself something that was almost a smile. I anticipated that condition. Minute 7. She slept 4 hours. It was not enough, and it was more than she'd managed in 2 days, and when she woke at 0500, the bay was quiet and gray with early light. And for a moment, just a moment, 5 or 6 seconds at most, she was nowhere. She was between the day before and the day ahead, and she existed in neither, suspended in the cleanest kind of silence. Then her left side reminded her where she was, and she came back fully. Tasha was asleep in the chair. She'd pulled it to the foot of the bed, and she was sitting in it sideways, with her head against the back and her arms crossed and her boots still on the sleep of someone who had decided to stay and had not planned further than that. Rachel looked at her for a moment and felt something that was very large and very simple, and that she did not try to name because naming it would have required disturbing it. She let her sleep. At 0600, a corpsman came in to check vitals and woke Tasha, who came fully alert in the way combat personnel do instantly, no gradual emergence present immediately. She looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at her. They had the conversation without words that they had been having for 3 deployments, the one that said, "I'm still here and I know," and that was close, and I know that too. "Testimony at 08, Rachel said. "I know, Marsh told me." Tasha straightened in the chair. "He also told me something else." Rachel waited. "They found Moran." Tasha said it carefully, testing the weight of it. "Not physically, not in custody, but they identified the route he used to access the base yesterday. He had a secondary ID in the system, a contractor credential that was created 14 months ago, using documentation that appeared legitimate. They've traced the credential back to the individual who created it in the system. Anchor, a subcontact of Anchor's. Someone 3 levels removed who didn't know what they were building." Tasha paused. "But the trace gives them his last confirmed location. He used a satellite phone relay 40 minutes after your call ended. They have a geographic position. Hart's people and the relevant partner agencies are..." She made a gesture that meant moving on it. Rachel sat with that. She thought about Marin's voice, the settled quality of it. She thought about what she'd said to Tasha the night before, "He's scared, he's running," and she thought about whether that was still true or whether the call had given him enough to feel steady again, and she decided the answer didn't change her part in this. Her part was the testimony. Her part was the record. Her part was saying clearly and completely what she had seen and letting the machinery built for exactly this purpose do what it was built to do. "How's Harris?" she said. Tasha's expression shifted into something warmer. "Awake, asking for his wife. They're working on getting her on a call. You understand, post-op, stable. She told the night nurse she wanted to thank the person who ran to get her." Tasha looked at her. The nurse had to explain that the person in question was also currently a patient. Rachel said nothing. "Martinez is sitting up. Cole apparently complained about the food, which the surgical team took as an excellent sign." Tasha shook her head slowly. 4 for 4. Rachel, all 4. The way she said it, not as a report, not as a statistic, but as something she needed Rachel to fully receive, made Rachel look away for a second. Out the window where the sky was doing its thing again, deciding between colors. "Yeah," Rachel said quietly. "All 4. Minute 10 major twist/audience retention hook. The formal testimony took 3 hours and was recorded by 2 devices simultaneously and transcribed in real time by a court reporter named Specialist Abrams, who had a focused calm that Rachel appreciated. She went through everything. She went through the Western sector, installation, the vehicle, the device, the man with his hands behind his back. She described what she saw with the precision that Adeyemi had noted and that Hart had anticipated and that Moran had tried and failed to prevent. She was precise about what she knew, and precise about what she inferred, and precise about the difference between them, because the difference mattered, and she had been in enough situations where imprecision had cost people things they couldn't get back. At one point, Ferrara stopped the recording to consult with Hart outside the room. They were gone for 11 minutes. When Hart came back, her expression had changed in a way that was small and significant. "We have him," she said. The room went still. "Not Moran, not yet." Hart sat down. "Anchor, the general officer he named last night, the name Moran gave us cross-referenced with the travel logs Torres pulled this morning, and the credential trace from the secondary ID, and the communication pattern from the Casper intercepts." She stopped, drew a breath. "He's been identified. He's currently at a command installation 200 miles from here. He does not yet know that he's been identified." Rachel looked at her. "When?" "Assets are in position now, within the hour." Hart met her eyes. "I wanted you to know before it happened, because without your report 18 months ago, and without your testimony this morning, and without what you did on that helicopter, and at that landing zone, and in this room last night," she paused. "It doesn't happen." Rachel didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking about the day, not yesterday's day, but the day 18 months ago, when she'd been standing near a support vehicle at a Western sector installation, and she'd seen something that made the back of her neck feel wrong, and she'd made the decision to write it down. A decision she'd made in about 30 seconds in the middle of a busy day that had seemed small and routine and professionally appropriate and nothing more. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Hart said. "I understand." The network, the operations he was running through Anchor, through Moran, through the assets embedded in field teams, it goes back 6 years. 6 years, Sergeant. And the thread that unravels it starts with a report you filed because you had a bad feeling about a device under a truck axle. Rachel looked at her hands, the pen she'd been holding during testimony. Her hands that had started IV lines and packed wounds and performed field surgery and carried litters across ground that was being shot at and written 31 pages of notes at 2 in the morning. Her ordinary hands that had been doing the job. "I almost didn't file it," she said. "I know. It's in your notes from last night." Hart's voice was quiet. "I'm glad you did." Minute 14, mini-climax. The news of Anchor's arrest reached Phoebe Kilo at 10:47. Rachel found out from Torres, who appeared in the doorway of the testimony room with his jacket half on and an expression of barely contained professional satisfaction, and said simply, "In custody, 40 minutes ago, no resistance." The testimony room, Hart Ferrara Abrams Torres. Rachel went quiet in a way that was entirely different from the operational quiet of a crisis. This was the quiet of a thing completing, of a structure that had been holding enormous pressure finally being allowed to release it. Ferrara put his pen down. He didn't pick it back up. Abrams stopped transcribing and sat back and looked at the ceiling with her hands in her lap. Hart stood. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room for a moment, and Rachel could see from the set of her shoulders what was happening. The private accounting of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is processing what it feels like to set it down. Rachel sat in her chair, her side aching, her body running on 4 hours of sleep and 2 days of adrenaline and something else. Some deeper fuel that didn't have a clinical name, but that everyone in a uniform eventually learned to recognize in themselves, the thing that keeps you functional when the physical and logistical resources have run out. She thought about what Hart had said. 6 years. A network running for 6 years, and the thread that ended it had started with her. With a moment of professional instinct and a decision to trust that instinct and put it on record. She thought about all the things that could have ended that thread before it started. If she'd talked herself out of filing the report. If Dustov 7 hadn't made it back. If Kowalski had stayed frozen. If Adeyemi's shot had been a half-second slower. If Park hadn't insisted on looking at her left side. If Harris's heart had not come back when she hit his chest. If any one of 50 moments had gone differently, the thread would have ended and the network would have kept running, and she would have been a name on a casualty report, and Anchor would have been someone's problem for another 6 years. She thought about all of that, and she let it move through her, and she let it go, because the only version of events that was useful to her was the one that had actually happened. Minute 16, they came to see her that afternoon, one at a time, the way people come to see someone they need to see but are not entirely sure how to approach. Harris came in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse who parked him at the foot of Rachel's bed and left. He was pale and had the particular quality of a man whose body was still arguing with him about everything that had happened to it, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and she thought that there was probably nothing either of them could say that would be adequate to the specific shape of the debt between them. And Harris apparently thought so too, because he didn't try. He said, "My wife's calling at 1400. That's good. I'm going to tell her about you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He gripped the arms of the wheelchair, once briefly the gesture of a man containing something. "She's going to want to send you something. She sends things, it's what she does. I'm telling you now so you're not surprised by a package of baked goods appearing from somewhere in Ohio." Rachel almost laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came up faster than she'd expected, genuine and sudden. "Tell her I prefer chocolate." Something moved across Harris's face that was too complicated for a single word. "Yes, Sergeant," he said softly. Yoon came next, moving on crutches with the focused determination of someone who has decided that physical limitation is a temporary and largely theoretical concept. She didn't say much. She sat on the edge of the empty bed across from Rachel's, and she looked at her and she said, "I was going to give up. When the M240 went quiet, I heard the shooting start from the north, and I thought, this is how it ends. Right here. But it didn't, Rachel said. But it didn't. Yoon looked at the crutches leaning against the bed beside her, because you kept running. I told you before you would have done the same. Maybe. Yoon looked up. But it was you who actually did it. That matters. It matters that it was actually you. Rachel didn't argue with her this time. Martinez sent a written note because he wasn't yet mobile, folded in half and delivered by the same corpsman who had been managing the room rotation with the patience of a saint. The note said, I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say much. Thank you for not leaving me behind. That's all. Martinez. Rachel folded it back along its crease and held it for a moment, and then put it in her jacket pocket. Cole appeared in the doorway at 1500, one arm in a sling, his chest dressed under a shirt he'd had to cut to accommodate the bandaging. And he looked at her the way you look at someone when the only honest thing is to look at them and not look away. He said, I want you to know I heard you the whole time, in the helicopter. I was in and out, but I kept hearing your voice, and I kept thinking somebody's still working. Somebody hasn't stopped. He paused. It kept me here. Rachel looked at him for a long time. I'm glad you're here, Cole. He nodded once sharply, the way men nod when they're not trusting their voice. Minute 20 audience retention hook / final major turn. At 1600, Kowalski found her one last time. The transport was being organized for 0600 the next morning, all 5 of them, the 4 patients and Rachel, moving together to the medical facility that Vasquez had been in contact with since the previous night. The logistics were Hart's problem, and she was handling them with the efficiency Rachel had come to expect, which meant they were being handled completely. Kowalski came in and stood in the way he'd been standing all along, that posture of a man who has stopped pretending he knows what he's doing and has discovered that honesty is a more sustainable position. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand. What's that? Rachel said. My after-action notes. Hart's investigator asked for written observations from everyone on the team. I wrote mine. He looked at the paper. I've written after-action reports before, training exercises, the simulation stuff. I've never written one where I had to, he stopped, where the things I was reporting actually happened. How was it, Hard? He was quiet for a moment. I wrote about the 3 seconds. She looked at him. He met her eyes. When I froze. In the helicopter, the first explosion. I wrote it down exactly as it happened. 3 seconds. What it felt like inside those 3 seconds. What ended them. He paused. I wanted it in the record. Not to flag myself, not as a confession, as information. Because if somebody reads it and they recognize it, if some other 22-year-old reads it and thinks that happened to me too, and I thought I was the only one. He stopped again. Reset. I wanted it in the record, he said simply. Rachel looked at him for a longer time about him. At this kid who had unfrozen and carried and lifted and held and run, and who was now on the other side of all of it, thinking about the 22-year-old who would come after him. That, she said, is the right instinct. He nodded. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He looked at her with the expression of someone about to say something final and aware of its finality. What happens to you now? Medical, recovery, whatever comes after that. She paused. Testimony probably more than once. The investigation is going to run for a long time. And Moran, they'll find him. She said it with the certainty she had, which was not the certainty of guaranteed outcome, but the certainty of a person who understands how these things move. The network is compromised, his assets are in custody, his identity is confirmed. And there is now a very detailed file being built by people whose entire professional function is finding people who don't want to be found. Kowalski nodded. He looked at the window. He looked back. Will you come back to the field? Is that a professional question or a personal one? He considered it honestly. Both, I think. She thought about Vasquez's voice when he'd said grade 2 splenic laceration. She thought about the broken ribs, which still made themselves known with every breath, not dramatically, just insistently, like a fact that required acknowledgement. She thought about 14 years and 3 deployments, and a report she'd almost not filed, in a helicopter she'd ridden down to the ground, and 4 patients who were alive in this building right now. I don't know yet, she said. That's the honest answer. He nodded slowly. Whatever you decide, he said. I hope it's the right thing for you. Not for the mission, for you. She looked at him and she felt the weight of the 24 hours behind them, the full accumulated weight of all of it, the fear and the work and the cold clarity and the names in the file and the voice on the radio and Harris's heart and Yoon's hand and the notepad with 31 pages and the call with Moran and the moment Torres had come to the doorway with his jacket half on, all of it, every bit of it. Sitting in the room with them in the particular way that the biggest days of your life tend to follow you around for a while before they find somewhere permanent to settle. "Good night, Kowalski," she said. He came to attention, not because protocol required it, because he wanted to. "Good night, Sergeant." He left, and Rachel sat alone in the quiet of the bay, and she breathed carefully around the broken ribs, and she thought about the next day's transport and the medical facility and the testimony and the long, slow work of the investigation and whatever came after that, and she held all of it, not with resignation, not with dread, but with the specific orientation of a person who knows what she is made of because she has been required to find out. Minute 24, final resolution. The transport left at 06:22 the next morning. 4 patients and 1 sergeant in a configuration that the logistics officer had clearly spent time on. Harris accessible Yoon, comfortable Martinez and Cole situated, so the ride would do the minimum additional damage. Rachel sat in the middle where she could see all of them and they could all see her. She didn't sleep on the transport. She thought about filing reports. She thought about all the things she would write down completely and precisely in the days ahead, not just for the investigation, not just for Hart's file, but for the record that outlasts all of them. The record that says what happened and who was there and what they chose. She thought about the after-action report from 18 months ago. 1 page, submitted through routine channels, almost not written, filed anyway because the back of her neck said to. She thought about all the things that 1 page had eventually moved. The facility came into view and the transport slowed, and the medical personnel were already outside waiting, and Harris looked over at her from his litter, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and they didn't need to. Yoon was awake and watching out the window. Martinez had his eyes closed, but she could tell from his breathing that he was present. Cole was talking to the corpsman beside him about something that was making the corpsman half smile, and Rachel thought that was probably exactly right, that some people move through catastrophe and come out the other side, still making the people around them half smile, and that this was not a trivial thing. This was in fact essential. The transport stopped. The doors opened. She stood up her left side, making its case one more time with the tireless persistence of something that knows it will eventually win, and she stood in the open doorway for 1 second before stepping down, and she looked at the 4 people she had kept alive across 200 miles of everything that had been thrown at all of them, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not pride and was not relief, but was the particular piece of a person who has been asked the hardest question available. What are you at the center of it when everything else has been stripped away and has answered it completely? What Rachel Donovan was at the center of it was someone who did not stop. Not when the helicopter was going down, not when her name came over the radio, not when the math came out wrong and she carried the litter anyway, not when the folder showed her sister's address, not when Moran's voice offered her an exit she could have taken, and she chose instead to stay in the room and hold everything she remembered and say it clearly. She did not stop. She had never stopped. And the people who were alive and breathing and walking out of that transport behind her were the proof of it, the living record, the most important document she would ever file. She stepped down onto solid ground. The morning was bright. Her team was behind her. Her patients were in front of her. And every single one of them had made it home.